As you may have noticed from the backgrounds of my videos, I collect a lot of films from the Criterion collection. But while I do like most of their catalog, they don't always preserve the best movies. The Bruce Lee set has Game of Death, a film made after the actor's death with some very embarrassing ways of shooting around this problem. There's also a few films in the Godzilla set that I don't really like either. There are even a few revered films in there that I think are pretty bad, like Tom Jones is just tacky, and there's heaps of problematic shit in The Night Porter. I also really don't like Gummo. I find it nihilistic and pointlessly grotesque. But for most of these films, I mean, I get it. I know why they're here. I get why Criterion shows them. These films have big names behind them, and there's some pedigree association present for why they get the Big C treatment. But then there's Jellyfish Eyes. Jellyfish Eyes is a 2013 Japanese modern fantasy film conceived by Takashi Murakami. Murakami is a contemporary artist who has done a little bit of everything. He's created art for museums, album covers for top artists, and for some reason, NFTs? And Jellyfish Eyes would be his directorial debut, with a script by Yoshihiro Nishimura, the director of such films as Mutant Girl Squad and Tokyo Gore Police. So on paper, this film sounded kinda cool. Here's a contemporary Japanese artist working with a director who composes absurdly gruesome movies. So, what did they end up making with Jellyfish Eyes? Well, they made Digimon. Okay, there's more to it than that, but the short answer is they basically made a Digimon movie. The film follows the new young kid in town called Masashi. He's moved to this new town with his mother and is depressed because his dad recently died. While in this town, he encounters a strange creature that looks like a jellyfish, with eyes. So Masashi names him Jellyfish Boy, and they become the best of friends. Now at first, Masashi wants to harbor Jellyfish Boy E.T. style, a la hiding him in his backpack. But he really doesn't have to around his classmates, because Masashi soon discovers that every kid in town has their own little CGI creature that they keep hidden away from the adults. These creatures are apparently called friends. So the friends come in various forms, from a gentle furry giant to a generic anime girl. So every young person in town has these friends, and they're controlled by these devices that are just called devices. The kids hide these friends from adults and make them battle each other in private. Now the friends are created by a secret research facility in this very town, but the research is evil and being run by these mysterious cloaked figures. So as the film proceeds, there's some monster battles, some bullying, and some tragedy. But what the film ultimately boils down to is all the friends combining forces to fight the ultimate evil monster conceived by negative energy. The giant evil monster is called Oval? Man, they're really not good with names in this film. Okay, so lessons are learned, sacrifices are made, and the sacrificing friends are revived just in time for a happy ending. Now, when I first watched this film, there was an obvious question that came up. What product is being promoted here? Is this based on a video game, or a trading card game, or comic book, or toy? I mean, it'd have to be. It has all the makings of a commercial film made to sell merchandise. But that's the strange thing about this movie. There is no franchise that the film is based on. I mean, okay, there are some previous art pieces by Murakami named Jellyfish Eyes, but somehow I don't think the film was made specifically to increase interest in those pieces. Now true, there are some plush toys from Jellyfish Eyes, but they seem to be very rare and incredibly expensive. Now for a movie about battling monsters, it's not unreasonable to assume that there was some video game to promote. But there doesn't seem to be any video games based on Jellyfish Eyes. And this aspect of the film not being based on a franchise just fascinated me, because the film kind of posed this interesting question. What if a film that looked like it was clearly built for commercialism didn't have a product to promote? Imagine watching Pokemon the first movie, but in a different world. So in this theoretical world, there is no Pokemon TV show, video game, card game, comic book, or any Pokemon merch to speak of. The only Pokemon anything is Pokemon the first movie. So without any of those franchise attachments, is Pokemon the first movie even a good movie? Now, I was into Pokemon when this movie was released into theaters, even if I was dismayed by the film, perhaps because I was watching it as a teenager. I found its existentialist quandaries fell on easy platitudes of individualism and friendship. But I also know that a lot of younger fans at the time just didn't care about any of that in the film. You see, fandoms often have a level of relational forgiveness regarding adaptations of their favorite properties. Many fans did not attend Pokemon the first movie in the theater, expecting to see a challenging animated film on the nature of existence and genetics. They wanted to see all caps Pokemon. They watched the show, they played the games, and they knew the lore. All the movie had to do was acknowledge all that, and it'd be everything the fervent fans desired. Also, a quick note to the defenders of this movie, I'm well aware that it was made for kids. I don't expect a Pokemon movie to have a scene where Mewtwo corners the heroes and delivers a 10-minute dissertation on the ethics of cloning. I'm not expecting that out of a film made for kids, so let's not get hung up on that. Jellyfish Eyes and Pokemon the first movie have some striking similarities. Both films are about unique entities created by a corporation for nefarious purposes. Both films are about how the power of friendship can triumph over more powerful forces that seek to remove identity. And both films are about the nature of developing life for the purpose of conquest inherent in mankind. Of course, the key difference between these two films is that one is selling a product and the other is not, but I think there's more to it than that. I remember there was a rumor circulating that Pokemon the first movie was intended to end the Pokemon show. Now, I couldn't substantiate this rumor with any evidence, but based on the text of the film, I can kind of see the framework for how that could come to be. In the first Pokemon movie, Mewtwo is bitter about being a Pokemon clone of Mew. He awakens to a world where he doesn't like that a few men have predetermined his fate in life. Having been robbed of a more natural birth and progression, Mewtwo strikes back at humanity by attempting to create his own world. He creates cloned Pokemon that battle for supremacy by fighting the originals. Now, during this grand battle of the cloned versus the originals, there was one line of dialogue that stuck out to me as Nurse Joy watches the carnage. She says that Pokemon shouldn't fight. Not like this, anyway. Now, the more observant viewer would note that there's little distinction between this battle in the movie and all the other Pokemon battles in the TV show, which were way more dangerous and violent than this one. So I initially scoffed at this line, but then thought, wait a minute. Was she having an epiphany? Because on its face, sure, a battle for genetic superiority is wrong. But Mewtwo's operations are not as highly radical as Team Rocket or Pokemon breeders. Now, the ethics of how these different groups reach their end goal are questionable, but they're all still building up their Pokemon to more or less fight. And this contrasts greatly with Jellyfish Eyes, in which characters explicitly say that they hate fighting. There's one scene in that film with a battle between the monsters that feels less like a monster battle and more like an ordered mob hit. The protagonists in that film don't want to engage in battle, and they have good reason for it, because all their hostile and negative energy will contribute to literally feeding a giant monster that will destroy everything. So yeah, Jellyfish Eyes wears its truth about the hideous nature of conflict and despair right on its sleeve. But as for Pokemon, fights are encouraged in the show and movie without much questioning. So when Nurse Joy takes notice of how empty this fighting is, there's a chord briefly struck here. Maybe Pokemon battles shouldn't continue. Perhaps breeding captive animals and pitting them against each other for a chance to attain an accolade is not worthwhile. Maybe Pokemon shouldn't be fighting, and maybe there just shouldn't be any more Pokemon trainers. But then Mewtwo just wipes all their memories, and nobody really learns anything at the end of this movie. Now, from a marketing perspective, we understand why the slate was quickly wiped clean here. This world needs to continue so that Ash can go on more Pokemon adventures and more Pokemon merch can be sold. But again, what if we didn't have all that? Would Pokemon the first movie still be good without all the Pokemon stuff surrounding the film? Well, I don't have a firm answer, but I do think the film would have a more revealing reflection of our world if it went down this route. Because there is one aspect of Jellyfish Eyes that makes the film more compelling, but more for its ambition than its execution. The movie was made in 2013, about 2 years after the Japanese earthquake that led to the Fukushima nuclear plant incident. There was real fear of a meltdown with the overheating reactors desperately needing cooling, and this eventually led to radiation being leaked into the surrounding environment. The event was so terrifying that it registered at the highest level of accident on the International Nuclear and Radiological Event Scale, a level additionally held followed by the Chernobyl disaster of 1986. Due to its environmental effects, the Fukushima event led to a massive and expensive cleanup effort and displaced thousands of residents. For being released so close to the incident, it's hard not to see some parallels. Now, the climax of a giant monster born from science is nothing new for Japan, but the relevancy is still potent. That said, Jellyfish Eyes has a little more hope in its narrative. The day is saved by the combined efforts of children using technological advancement to prevent technological destruction. It's a story about the next generation fighting for their own existence, given the mess left behind by the previous one. Now, that might be reading too much meaning into the story, but where else is there to go with a film like this? There's no franchise to sell here, and thus its broader themes, while not that unique or well executed, come off less like an excuse to sell toys. And the same could probably be said of Pokemon the first movie if we look at it from the perspective of cloning and gene manipulation. When the Pokemon movie first hit movie theaters, we were still in the midst of the Human Genome Project. The project aimed to map and sequence the genes that comprise human beings. It was a massive undertaking for a better understanding of who we are as a species, and it took a long time to complete, having started in 1990 and being more or less complete by 2003. However, there were concerns about the ethics of this project, because once you've figured out human genes, you might be able to manipulate them. So if you know your baby is going to be born with a certain disease or disorder, what if you could just remove it? It's a technology we already have with CRISPR, short for Clustered Regularly Interspaced Short Palindromic Repeats. CRISPR makes editing DNA possible, essentially snipping out the undesirable strands and replacing them with better ones. And if you have a child born with something like sickle cell disease, using this technology could vastly improve that child's life. But how much gene editing is too much? Do you rewrite someone's DNA if they have autism? How much say would you have in that manipulation, and how much of that person would change with this procedure? There are some real ethical questions on how we advance with this technology, and I don't think there's any easy answers for how we move forward with it. The ethics of gene manipulation come up very early in the Pokemon movie. Mewtwo is birthed and wakes up pissed that his entire existence was the product of tinkering with DNA. And sure, Mewtwo was given life by these scientists, but only on their terms. He was created specifically for what the scientists wanted and didn't have control over what parts of his being he'd prefer to keep or discard. And when your agency is stripped away over how much control you have over your body, it's easy to side with Mewtwo on this issue. Mewtwo's plan after that point is to further tamper with genes to create others in his image. After all, if the scientists could just clone any Pokemon, who's to say that Mewtwo couldn't do the same? And there's a cyclical nature to how Mewtwo approaches this topic, and ultimately arrives at the conclusion that life is shaped by what you do with your own more than what others have done to you. Now, divorced from all the Pokemon franchise crap, there is something to Pokemon's narrative about cloning, gene manipulation, and life itself. But again, much like Jellyfish Eyes, it's kind of sloppy in its execution. But if you tilt your head away from your Pokemon video game and squint at the screen, you can just barely make out the semblance of a film trying to tackle something that was topical. And this is why I'm still thinking about Jellyfish Eyes after all these years. It's a Pokemon movie without Pokemon baggage, and that makes its simpler themes of friendship, cooperation, and the dangers of technology seem more pronounced. There tends to be an easy method of dismissing a commercial film as being made solely for profit, which is an oddly ubiquitous statement for a mainstream movie. Like seriously, no big studio is going to spend millions on making a film and then millions more marketing it and then just turn around and tell its shareholders, yeah, we're not expecting much money on this one. But I believe that any idea for a film can be successful if it's well produced, even if it's a sequel or a remake or based on a franchise meant to sell toys. But of course, that all depends on how the film turns out in the end. Jellyfish Eyes is a bad movie in the same way that Pokemon the first movie is a bad movie. It's because there was potential to explore something relevant, and it was then squandered for a simplistic, safe commercial film suitable for kids. And maybe this is just me, but I think kids deserve more thoughtful films than that. I think kids deserve something more than the mere platitudes of Jellyfish Eyes or the simplified thesis of the Pokemon movie, where the Pokemon Meowth has to literally translate the moral message for the audience. Because if these types of films had a heavier focus on their themes, there's at least something more to admire besides how many Pokemon can be shoved into theatrical animation. It's not enough to just make an original film not based on an IP. It still has to be a good film first, whether you're trying to sell toys or not. However, with both producers and fans of a particular franchise, they tend to be more forgiving. For those people, the product comes first and the narrative second. And just so I'm being clear here, it's not lost on me that there's an entirely different view of these films, separate from my own analysis. I might look at the scene of Mewtwo coming to an epiphany about nature versus nurture, and think about what moral implications this holds for how humans interact and retool Pokemon for their benefit. But a Pokemon fan who has played all the games and collected all the merch is probably only thinking that all the Pokemon should just attack Mewtwo in this scene and that one of them should trap him with a Master Ball. But I think Jellyfish Eyes actually has some commonalities with a different type of animated film, the knockoff kind. There's a tradition that if Disney or DreamWorks ends up making a hit animated film, a cheaper studio will try to piggyback off the same concept to gain similar attention. Like, did you want to see Ratatouille? Well, how about Ratatouille? It's just as good. These knockoff films don't have anywhere near the same level of marketing, nor do they have big brand deals attached to them. And while it's easy to write them off as tacky and cheap imitations, they do pose a challenge. What if the concept for an animated film was stripped of its multi-level marketing strategy? What if it didn't have a soundtrack by Smash Mouth and a product tie-in with McDonald's? Is that film still good without all that? And the answer is usually yes. Long past the marketing hype, people still talk about movies like Toy Story and Shrek in a positive light, beyond just the nostalgia of it all. It's because these films, at their core, had a good script before the toys were lining shelves. Now, the knockoff films never really had that deconstruction because everything was cheap, including the animation and the writing. And for as much as I don't like Jellyfish Eyes, I'm not willing to go so far as to call it entirely cheap. Like, don't get me wrong, it's not high-quality CGI or compositing, it's clearly on a limited budget, but, I mean, amateurs didn't make this. It's from the dude who made Tokyo Gore Police. But there is a resemblance to those knockoff movies in how Murakami and Nishimura have taken the monster training subgenre and tried to wield it into something of their own. By the 2010s, there was a wealth of similar Pokemon-style franchises. And you're probably familiar with the usual suspects here, you know, Monster Rancher, Metabots, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Dragon Drive, Spider Riders, Duel Masters, Yokai Watch, and so on and so forth. This is an entire industry with movies and TV shows built on the premise of selling merchandise. But more to the point with Jellyfish Eyes, it's created a language. And I can't help but feel there's an attempt being made by Murakami and Nishimura to say something different through the tongue of monster collecting. Remember when I mentioned the Pokemon movie's stumbling attempt to question its own violence? Well, Jellyfish Eyes actually tackles this topic much better. One of Masashi's friends, Saki, says rather bluntly that she hates fighting. She hates when the friend creatures fight, and she hates it when her parents fight. Now, Saki's opposition to violence isn't exactly well written, but it was a little bit of a relief to address the concerns of kids before they go back to stopping a bunch of villains in black cloaks and a giant monster that wants to destroy the Earth. This is why I view Jellyfish Eyes as a fascinating failure. It stumbles weirdly close to using the Pokemon formula for something more profound and reflective about our world. And I think this is a far more admirable ambition than just making another franchise to sell more merchandise. So when it was announced that Murakami decided to return to Jellyfish Eyes with a sequel, I gotta be honest, I'm a little bit intrigued. I'm curious to see if there's something more compelling in the next Jellyfish Eyes movie that will find something to say about the world to young people. I'm not getting my hopes up too high here, but there's potential. And who knows, in my wildest dreams, maybe, just maybe, the Jellyfish Eyes sequel will be a crossover with Tokyo Gore Police.
It's basically just part of the whole marketing thing to encourage kids to be inquisitive about these Pokemon things. And I know they're obsessed by them. I know there are 4 million Game Boys out there, and they all have the trading cards, and they watch the TV show and all of that. But what is this really about? I mean,
well, it's about love. It's about a lot of things.
It's about acquiring Pokemons.
I